guys, and welcome to Lecture 3. Today we're going to be talking about classical Greece, early Greek life, religion, some arts, a very famous book called the Iliad, and the difference between Sparta and Athens. So let's get started. The first thing I want to note is that there are different eras of Greece. So we have ancient, classical, and Hellenistic. They go in alphabetical order, A, C, H. But remember, we're getting closer and closer to the year 0. So even though time is going forward, the numbers of the centuries are going down. It can be confusing, but that's okay. What's important to know is that our idea of like Athens versus Sparta is different from classical Greece, where we have our philosophers and stuff, and then Hellenistic Greece is the era of expansion when Alexander the Great goes to Africa and the Middle East and stuff like that. So here's a map of Greece. This is like a zoomed in map of Europe, would be kind of over here, and this area is like Turkey, the area, the beginning of like the Middle Eastern area. And there are different city-states. We have Troy, Athens, and Sparta. Now, these were our main groups here, and Troy was called Ilianus, I believe. That's how you say it. And so we are going to talk about Troy a little bit when we talk about the Iliad, but our main city-states that are competing for money and power and stuff is Sparta versus Athens. So the Greeks lived in a time during the Dark Ages. There was ancestors of the Greeks, Minoan, Crete, and Mycenaeans. It was around that same place in Europe where modern-day Greece is. But Greece entered a Dark Ages. They didn't trade as much. Their iron got replaced with bronze. But what's really interesting is literacy ended. Can you guys imagine that? Can you imagine losing literacy? Like, there was obviously the Epic of Gilgamesh, we talked about the cuneiform, the writing on the stones, but in early Dark Ages Greece, people did not know how to write or read. And my question to you guys is, do you think someday we could lose literacy? Like if social media became really pictorial? Even though Greeks couldn't read or write, they still had stories. And they had this epic poem called the Iliad, and it is by a Greek poet named Homer. And originally, this was just passed down orally because, like I said, there was no reading and writing. But eventually it gets written down, and this tells the story of the Trojan War, which is Troy versus the Greeks. And if we look back again, Troy is up here, and then this was the Greek world. So the story opens up in the Trojan War, and it's been going on for a while. And I like this telling of the Iliad. It is like the Iliad's simplified. I'm going to include it in this video. If she goes too fast for you guys, I have another one that is slower, but I think like less funny. But I want for you guys to try to watch this funny one, okay? So I'm going to include this now. So what do you guys think is the main idea of the Iliad? This is a story of how the gods intervene with humanity, but at the end, it really is a story of heroicism and friendship. So how is this significant to Greek culture and history? Well, we say that being a hero is very, very important to our Greeks. They have a close relationship with the gods. They can talk to the gods, they can interact with them, and they have power to change things. Human beings have the power to change the gods' plans. This is really significant to the idea of Greek identity. What does it mean to be a Greek? It means to be strong, to be powerful, to have say in your own life. This is very important to the Greek identity. The next thing I want to talk about is the polis. So a polis is an urban and rural area combined. So for example, in this photo, This would be our urban area, and then this is all the rural area. If you can see the dotted line, it shows that everything is still in this one polis. So everything inside of this dotted line is a polis. Doesn't matter if it's urban or rural. The next thing is there was tyranny in the Greek polis. So we think of the Greeks and the Romans, which we'll get to in a couple lectures, as like starting democracy and being really democratic, having people vote and stuff. Well, it wasn't always like that. There were tyrannies and people, everyday people, just like how we said in the Iliad, everyday people could do a coup d'etat, which means a takeover or an overthrowing of the government. And so some of the polises were ruled by hired soldiers. Okay, so the Greeks, to just recap, the Greeks had a Dark Ages where they didn't have literacy. They had a time where they told stories about being heroic, and the people in charge of their government was basically the strongest guy. Whoever was the strongest guy to overthrow the guy before him. But things start to change when we have an identity in the polis. Before we start comparing Athens versus Sparta down to really fine points, I want to show you guys two different videos on what life was like in Sparta and what life was like in Athens. And the Spartan video is like a recreation documentary, and the Athens video is a TED-Ed one. So I'm going to play those, and then we'll get back to our discussion. So I'm going to go through these slides. We have the Athens side and the Spartan side, okay? So when the Athenians are getting together and they're defining themselves and their government, what is really important to them is that they have a direct democracy. What would happen was there would be white stones and black stones, and every time there was a big decision to be made, every man that could vote, which we'll go over what makes a man that could vote, would get a stone, and they would put white for yes and black for no. And so they would literally vote on the laws, every single person, okay? In our country, in America, we vote for a leader who then votes for us. We don't have a direct democracy. We actually have a republic, but we won't get into that. Anyways, in ancient Athens, voting men had the power to vote on everything. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of arguments and things like that, but this put the power in people. There was also an assembly of those who kind of directed the decisions, things like that. So they would talk about what needs to be voted on, and then people would vote. Again, I put the assembly was open to all citizens with an asterisk because you needed to be a man of some type of wealth or power. Like a slave man couldn't vote, a poor man couldn't vote. We're going to talk a little bit about Pericles later, but during the time of Pericles, which is who started Athens, citizens were paid for a jury service. So not only wealthy people could participate, but poor people too, which is basically what we have today in America, where you could be called for jury duty and you get paid. The one thing I do want to note is that as democratic as Athens was, women did not participate in any political life. On Sparta's side, we have something called an oligarchy, which means two kings. An oligarchy is like two rulers, and these two kings were in charge of the military and religion. There were people who oversaw daily operations, and they also had a senate of 28 people. Now, I shouldn't just say people. These were 28 men over 60, and they were elected for life. And Sparta was a military-focused polis. So if you were a man in Sparta and you lived to be 60 years old, it meant that you survived so many battles. So getting to be old in Sparta was a huge accomplishment. The assembly, so that's the Senate. one part. And then there's the assembly, which is any man over 30. And basically you could like support or veto decisions by shouting. So whoever can yell the most over the decisions being made. But again, women couldn't participate. Even though you were Spartan versus Athens, still women could not participate. There's also a social structure divide based on social classes in Athens, where the top are aristocrats or rich people, the middle is farmers, and the lowest are craftspeople. There's medics, or people that came from outside of the city, and they weren't allowed to own land or anything, but they could run businesses. Slaves are the lowest class. You could murder a slave. A unique job is that the slaves were the police. And women were rarely seen outside of the home. So even though Athens is a little bit more refined or a little bit more fancy than Sparta, women still did not have rights. Sparta had 3 classes. The Spartanates, which were the voting military men who lived in barracks. So a barrack is like a military base, pretty much. The Paroisi, which are the free men, and the bottom are the helots, or the serfs, like the peasants. They were treated like slaves, and they had to give half of their produce to the people that owned land, kind of like rent. In Sparta, women did have a couple rights. They were more independent in Sparta than Athens, but they still didn't have that many. The next thing is values. Athens, they value democracy, civic responsibility, or doing what you have to do to help Athens, and superiority, or being better than other people. As far as Sparta goes, they were very militaristic. So children of citizens were raised to be Spartan and taught to live on nothing, which we're going to talk about. The Spartanite citizens were not permitted to own gold or silver or luxuries, so they weren't superior to anyone. Children were taught to respect the elderly, women, and warriors. Spartan mothers would say to their sons, either come back with your shield or on it. And on it meaning you're dead and they're carrying you back. But let's take a deeper look at the role of women. Athenian women and girls were kept in the home with no participation in sports or politics, like I said. Wives were considered property of their husbands, and they could do domestic crafts like basket weaving, stuff like that. Some women could have like a purpose in ritual events, especially if it was about a goddess, like Athena was the goddess of Athens. And prostitutes were not confined to the home. So if you were a Spartan woman walking around outside, people would assume you were a prostitute. So husbands did not want their women to leave their house. In Sparta, however, girls are educated and could participate in sports just like boys were. The goal was to produce women that could make strong, healthy babies. Strong, healthy male babies. At the age of 18, she'd be assigned a husband and return home. Spartan women were free to move around and enjoyed a great deal of freedom. So they couldn't vote. They had few rights in politics, but they didn't have to worry about not being outside of the house. And domestic crafts were usually the jobs of craft people. So in Sparta, there would be a basket weaver, whereas in Athens, there might be just women do the basket weaving. Anyway, Spartan women would oversee and guard the land when the men were away at war. So she needed to be tough. You wanted your wife to be tough and strong because you didn't want your land to be stolen when you were away at war. There's also education. So boys were taught reading, writing skills, poetry, all these things. And wealth decided how long you could go to school and how much you could study. But everyone would have military training. All the boys would have military training until the age of 20. Girls received little education. Unless you were rich, you could hire your own tutor. And the education of girls usually involves spinning, weaving, or other domestic arts. So like spinning wool, things like that. Now the Spartan education is very different. From ages 0 to 1, boys were left to die at some point. I know that sounds crazy, but the idea was if a baby wasn't strong enough, then him grown up would definitely not be strong enough. So they would rather the baby die than put all of this military training into a boy that will die eventually. At the age of 7, you start military training, and you're only given a cloak. You're not given anything else because they wanted to teach you to steal. They wanted to teach you to be resourceful and kill squirrels and rats and stuff to learn survival skills. At the age of 7. At 20, you're placed into your ranks, into the official ranks. But at 30, you can marry, but you still have to live with other soldiers. So you could have a wife, and instead of going to work and coming home at night, you could see her, but then you had to go back to your barracks at night. Girls were not left out to die, and they were educated at 7 in reading, writing, and survival skills, just like the boys. Not as much harsh conditions, but they were allowed to learn, unlike the Athenians. My question to you guys as we wrap this up is, where would you want to live, provided you were a rich, wealthy man? And that's actually going to be your homework assignment. The last thing that I'm going to say for today is a part about the Great Peloponnesian Wars. So this is right on the turning point of ancient turning into classical Greece. And it's when the Athenians and the Spartans, their war kind of ends, okay? The Spartans, they want to win, they want to draw the Athenians out. The Athenians have this big wall around their city-state, and the only way to have war with them is to get them to leave. But Athens, they're really patient. They're not going to leave, okay? But Sparta ends up attacking the Athenian navy, and then Athens signs a 50-year peace treaty. But it only lasts 3 years. Eventually, the Spartans win, and there's the surrender of Athens in 404 BC. And that is going to bring us right up until our classical Greece, which we're going to talk about next class. So you guys know what your homework assignment is. Let me know if you have any questions. Okay, bye.